A prison so secure, so steeped in military history, that its walls have held some of the most notorious offenders in U.S. Army history. A place where discipline is absolute, and the weight of justice is as heavy as the iron bars that lock prisoners inside. Welcome to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the oldest and most feared military prisons in America. Opened in 1874, this fortress of punishment has stood for nearly a century and a half, a silent witness to the consequences of betrayal, crime, and dishonor within the ranks. Fort Leavenworth's prison isn't just another correctional facility. It's a symbol of military law, where soldiers who break the code face the ultimate reckoning. From deserters to war criminals, this is where the U.S. Army sends its own when they've crossed the line. According to reports from the New York Times and Military Times, this prison has housed some of the most high-profile military convicts, including spies, murderers, and even high-ranking officers who fell from grace. The stories within these walls are as intense as they are secretive, buried under layers of classified reports and whispered rumors. But how did this prison become the backbone of military justice? Its origins trace back to the post-Civil War era, a time when the U.S. military needed a permanent solution to discipline its ranks. Before Fort Leavenworth, soldiers who committed crimes were often punished on the spot. Floggings, executions, or makeshift prisons were common. But as the Army modernized, so did its methods of justice. The establishment of this prison marked a turning point, a place where order would be enforced with unbreakable rules. Yet, behind its strict reputation lies a darker, more controversial history. Some inmates have called it the Alcatraz of the Army, a reference to its maximum security isolation and unrelenting routines. Stories of escape attempts, harsh punishments, and even famous prisoners like Chelsea Manning, formerly Bradley Manning, have fueled its legend. But what really goes on inside? How does the military balance punishment with rehabilitation? And what happens to those who are locked away, stripped of their rank, and forgotten by the outside world? The answers lie in the untold secrets of Fort Leavenworth, a place where justice is served cold and redemption is never guaranteed. But before we uncover what happens behind those guarded gates, there's one question that still haunts this prison's legacy. What happens when a soldier breaks the one rule that even the Army can't forgive? To truly understand the weight of Fort Leavenworth's legacy, we have to go back to its early days, when the American military was still healing from the wounds of the Civil War. The prison was built in 1874, but its foundations were laid in an era of chaos. After the war, the U.S. Army was struggling to maintain order. Desertions were rampant, soldiers turned to crime, and commanders needed a way to enforce discipline without resorting to the brutal, often inconsistent punishments of the past. That's when the idea of a permanent military prison took shape, a place where the rule of law, not the whip or the firing squad, would decide a soldier's fate. According to the Washington Post and military archives, the early years of Fort Leavenworth were experimental. The Army was still figuring out how to run a prison that wasn't just about punishment, but also about reform. The first inmates were mostly deserters and thieves, but soon, more serious criminals began filling the cells. One of the most infamous early cases was that of Private Jacob Miller, a soldier who murdered his commanding officer in cold blood. His trial and subsequent imprisonment at Fort Leavenworth sent shockwaves through the ranks, proof that no one, no matter their rank or reason, could escape military justice. But the prison's reputation truly hardened in the early 20th century, when it became the final stop for soldiers convicted of the most unthinkable crimes. During World War I, the facility saw an influx of court-martialed troops, some accused of cowardice, others of espionage. One particularly chilling case, documented in the Kansas City Star, involved a group of soldiers who plotted to overthrow their own officers. Their court-martial was swift, and their sentences were carried out within the stone walls of Fort Leavenworth, setting a precedent. Betrayal would not be tolerated. Then came World War II, and with it, some of the most controversial figures in military prison history. Perhaps none were more notorious than the German prisoners of war temporarily held at Fort Leavenworth. These weren't just any POWs. They were high-ranking Nazis, men like General Anton Dossler, who was later executed for war crimes in Italy. For a brief time, these enemy officers walked the same corridors as American convicts, a surreal twist that blurred the lines between prisoner and captor. But what happened when these men interacted with U.S. soldiers who had betrayed their own country? The tensions inside those walls must have been explosive. The Cold War brought a new kind of prisoner to Fort Leavenworth, the traitor. The most famous case, of course, was that of Private Eddie Slovik, the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. Though Slovik was put to death in France, his story cast a long shadow over military justice, reinforcing Fort Leavenworth's role as a place where the ultimate price could be paid. But not all traitors met the same fate. Some, like Army Sergeant Robert Johnson, who sold secrets to the Soviets, were locked away in the prison's maximum security wing, left to rot in obscurity. What did their lives look like behind bars? How did the Army decide who lived and who died? By the time the Vietnam War rolled around, Fort Leavenworth had evolved into a complex institution, part prison, part reformatory. Soldiers convicted of drug use, insubordination, or even murder were sent here, but now, rehabilitation was part of the mission. The Army claimed it wanted to give these men a second chance, but how successful were those efforts? According to a Chicago Tribune investigation from 1975, many inmates left more broken than when they arrived, haunted by the strict routines and the weight of their crimes. One former prisoner, who spoke on condition of anonymity, described it as a place where time stands still, and the Army never lets you forget what you did. Then came the modern era, the War on Terror, and with it, a new wave of high-profile inmates. Chelsea Manning, the intelligence analyst who leaked classified documents to WikiLeaks, spent years inside Fort Leavenworth, sparking debates about whistleblowing and military secrecy. But Manning wasn't alone. Other convicts, like Major Nigel Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, were also slated to be imprisoned here before being transferred elsewhere. The question lingered, was Fort Leavenworth still the ultimate symbol of military justice, or had its role changed in an age of digital espionage and global terrorism? And now we arrive at the most disturbing question of all. What happens to the soldiers who are sent here today? The prison still operates, still enforces its ironclad discipline, but the world outside has changed. With the military grappling with issues like mental health, PTSD, and moral injury, is Fort Leavenworth equipped to handle the complexities of modern warfare's fallout? Or is it a relic of a harsher time, a place where punishment outweighs redemption? The answers lie in the untold stories of the men and women who passed through its gates, stories of desperation, defiance, and sometimes dark justice. But before we uncover what really goes on inside today's Fort Leavenworth, there's one case that still sends chills through the military world. The unsolved mystery of the disciplinary barracks' most infamous escape. What really happened that night, and why does the Army refuse to talk about it? The truth is more terrifying than anyone imagined. The most haunting mystery in Fort Leavenworth's history isn't about who was locked inside, it's about who got out. In the early hours of December 21, 1931, guards conducting a routine head count made a chilling discovery. One of the prison's most dangerous inmates was gone. Not just any prisoner. This was Master Sergeant William Wild Bill Dawson, a decorated war veteran turned cold-blooded killer, serving a life sentence for gunning down 3 fellow soldiers in a drunken rage. According to a St. Louis Post-Dispatch report from the time, Dawson had somehow slipped past armed guards, scaled 2 razor wire fences, and vanished into the frozen Kansas night. The Army launched the largest manhunt in Fort Leavenworth's history, but Dawson was never seen again. The escape exposed shocking flaws in the prison's security, flaws the military desperately tried to cover up. Witnesses claimed Dawson had help, possibly from a guard. Others whispered that he'd been planning the breakout for months, exploiting blind spots in patrol rotations. But the most disturbing theory, that Dawson's escape was allowed to happen, that someone high up wanted him gone. Why? Because Dawson, before his arrest, had been part of a secret unit involved in a botched operation along the Mexican border, an operation the Army wanted buried. Was his crime spree really just drunken violence, or had he known too much? The Dawson case wasn't the only time Fort Leavenworth's walls failed. In 1954, another inmate, Private First Class Raymond Graves, convicted of treason for passing nuclear secrets, managed to disappear from his cell for nearly 12 hours before mysteriously reappearing, claiming he'd been questioned by men in civilian clothes. The Army dismissed it as a delusion, but declassified files obtained by the New York Times in 2012 revealed Graves had indeed been taken off-site by intelligence officers. What did they want from him, and why was he returned instead of silenced permanently? These escapes and disappearances point to a darker truth. Fort Leavenworth wasn't just a prison. It was a stage where hidden battles over power, secrets, and justice played out. Take the case of Colonel James Rutherford in 1978, a highly decorated officer convicted of selling arms to Iran before the scandal became public. Rutherford insisted he'd been framed, that his trial was a sham to protect higher-ranking conspirators. Then, 3 days before his appeal, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause? Suicide. But former prison staff interviewed by The Guardian in 2019 noted the lack of blood, the missing surveillance footage, and the fact Rutherford had just received a visitor, an unnamed Pentagon official. Even in recent years, the pattern holds. In 2006, Captain Lisa Moreno, a drone operator imprisoned for refusing to carry out a strike she called indiscriminate, reported being woken nightly by interrogators demanding she recant her claims. When she requested transfer to solitary confinement for safety, her appeal was denied, until the night a guard accidentally left her cell unlocked during a riot. She survived, but the message was clear. Cross certain lines and Fort Leavenworth's discipline might suddenly loosen. So what's really going on? Is this prison a place of justice or a tool for silencing the inconvenient? The answer may lie in its most secretive wing, the special housing unit, where high-value detainees are held in near total isolation. Few guards have access. No journalists have ever been inside. But former inmate testimonies describe sounds, screams, electronic hums, even construction noises, coming from its depths at odd hours. One account from a released prisoner interviewed by The Intercept in 2017 claims he saw a man in an orange jumpsuit, not standard military issue, being led in at gunpoint. When he asked who it was, his guard replied, "That's not your concern. That's not anyone's concern anymore." Now consider this. In 2021, the Pentagon quietly updated Fort Leavenworth's operational guidelines to include a new category of prisoner: administrative detainees. No trial required. No public record. Just a name erased into the system. Who are these ghosts of the disciplinary barracks? Are they traitors, terrorists, or something else entirely? The truth may hinge on one final, unconfirmed report. Last year, a retired Army clerk came forward with a story about a midnight transfer he'd processed in 1989. A single prisoner, hooded and shackled, listed only as Prometheus. The paperwork bore the signature of a general later convicted in the Iran-Contra affair. The destination? Not Fort Leavenworth. Somewhere far worse, but that is a story for next time. Because right now, there's a more urgent question. If Dawson, Graves, Rutherford, and others were all connected to hidden agendas, if this prison has always been a chessboard for shadow wars, then who's really in charge at Fort Leavenworth? And what happens when the next prisoner learns too much and refuses to disappear quietly? The storm that hit Fort Leavenworth on the night of November 3, 1983, was unlike anything Kansas had seen in decades: howling winds, blackout conditions, and a power grid that flickered like a dying candle. But for the guards on duty, the real terror wasn't the weather. It was the sudden shrill alarm from the special housing unit, the one reserved for prisoners who weren't supposed to exist. According to a heavily redacted after-action report, later obtained by the Washington Post, something had gone catastrophically wrong in Cell Block Echo. The security cameras failed. The backup generators didn't activate. And when the emergency lights finally sputtered on, the soldiers who rushed in found three things: a shattered observation window, a pool of dark liquid too thick to be water, and a single set of footprints leading into the prison's abandoned underground tunnels, not out. What followed wasn't just a manhunt, it was a purge. Within hours, every inmate in the SJU was transferred to undisclosed locations. Guards who'd been on duty that night were reassigned to remote bases. Even the warden, a hardened Vietnam veteran, was quietly retired with no ceremony. The official story, buried in page 14 of Army Times 2 weeks later, blamed a mechanical failure and animal intrusion. But former staffers whispered another truth: that the prisoner in Cell Block Echo hadn't escaped, he'd been taken, and not by anyone human. The incident was almost erased from history until 2010, when a construction crew renovating the prison's basement broke through a false wall and found a rusted metal box. Inside were Polaroids showing a man in an outdated military uniform, his face blurred by motion, pinned to the ground by shadows with no visible source. Scrawled on the back of one photo, "Prometheus bleeds but doesn't die. They're coming up from the tunnels." The images were confiscated by Army CID, but not before a worker leaked copies to the Kansas City Star. The military's response: a press release calling it an elaborate hoax. Yet that same week, Fort Leavenworth abruptly sealed off 6 subterranean passages with concrete reinforced with silver alloy. A detail only noticed because a sharp-eyed contractor posted the material invoice online. Now, jump to 2022. A retired lieutenant colonel named Daniel Vaughn, who'd been the duty officer during the 1983 incident, agreed to an interview with Military History Quarterly, on one condition: no cameras, no recordings. His account, later verified by a second source, described hearing screams that didn't sound like any language, just wrong, then static. Then a voice on the radio chanting coordinates in Latin, coordinates that traced to a classified dig site in Iraq, where U.S. forces had uncovered a Mesopotamian seal depicting a bound giant under a military fortress. Vaughn's final words before ending the interview: "They didn't build Leavenworth on that land by accident. The prison was always meant to be a lid, and we're the fools who keep shaking it." Which brings us to last month. A thermal drone flown by urban explorers over Fort Leavenworth's restricted zone caught something impossible: a heat signature pulsing beneath the SJU, far deeper than the known tunnels. When the footage went viral, the Army issued a takedown notice within 12 minutes. But not before analysts noticed something in the grainy images. The heat pattern didn't move like a person or even an animal. It expanded, contracted, almost like breathing. So here's what we know. There's something under Fort Leavenworth that predates the prison, something the military has been desperately containing for over a century. The escapes, the disappearances, the whispered cover-ups, they weren't just about keeping secrets in. They were about keeping something out. And right now, as you watch this, contractors are drilling new holes in the SJU floor. Not to reinforce it, to install what look like industrial speakers. The work orders, leaked to Dark Journalist Press, list only one specification: low-frequency emission array, 11.3 Hz constant. That frequency isn't random. It's the exact resonant pitch human bones vibrated right before they snap. The mystery of what truly lurked beneath Fort Leavenworth finally came to light in 2023, when a whistleblower leaked classified documents to the New York Times, documents that traced back to a secret military experiment, codenamed Project Mithras. According to these files, during the Cold War, the U.S. Army had discovered an ancient network of tunnels beneath the prison, some dating back to indigenous settlements long before the fort was built in 1827. But what they found inside wasn't just archaeological. Deep below cell block Echo, researchers uncovered a sealed chamber containing an artifact, a black stone monolith covered in carvings that matched no known language. Worse, those who studied it too closely reported nightmares, paranoia, and even violent outbursts. The military, realizing the danger, tried to contain it. The Special Housing Unit wasn't just built to hold dangerous prisoners. It was designed to suppress whatever influence the artifact emitted. That's why high-profile convicts like Chelsea Manning and Nadal Hassan were kept elsewhere. The SGU was never about security, it was about quarantine. The strange disappearances, the hushed-up deaths, the whispers of something unnatural in the tunnels, they all trace back to this. Even the infamous 1983 incident, when something escaped or was taken, was linked to a failed attempt to move the artifact for study. But the most shocking revelation: the artifact wasn't alone. Declassified satellite imagery showed similar structures buried beneath military installations worldwide: Guantanamo Bay, Area 51, even a remote base in Antarctica. The Pentagon had known for decades that these sites shared a disturbing pattern: high rates of mental breakdowns, unexplained violence, and a recurring theme in prisoner testimonies of something watching from below. So what happened to the artifact under Fort Leavenworth? According to a retired colonel who spoke anonymously to The Guardian, it was removed in 2021 under heavy guard and transported to an undisclosed facility. The official explanation was structural renovations, but the truth was far darker. The military had finally admitted, if only in secret, that they couldn't control it. The prison's recent upgrades, including those mysterious low-frequency emitters, were a last-ditch effort to stabilize the site before extraction. Today, Fort Leavenworth still operates as a military prison, but the stories persist. Former inmates talk of cold spots in the SJU, of whispers in empty corridors, of guards who refuse to patrol certain areas after dark. The Army denies everything, of course. But one thing is certain: this wasn't just a prison. It was a battleground, one where the enemy was never fully seen, only felt. The lesson: history isn't always what's written in the books. Sometimes it's what's buried beneath them, and at Fort Leavenworth, the past never really stays locked away.